So the concept of half-Earth socialism, just give us a sense of what you mean by that.
I'll start. So Half-Earth Socialism is basically two projects in one, and one is to really think through what socialism is. And we make an argument, because I think a lot of left-wingers can't really give you a straight answer, or maybe they will harken back to a Keynesian kind of post-war welfare state, and or maybe some kind of anarchist utopia where there's no state and people can do whatever they want, or who knows what, right? Or maybe some kind of cybernetic future of like where computers will figure everything out. So we were dissatisfied with that approach, and then we tried to think through using an engagement with economic theory, with planning theory, with ecology, and new climate sciences to think through ways to build a socialist society and then create mechanisms to have an economy without markets. And so that's, and there's many ways to do that. People can decide different levels of energy production, how they produce their energy, how they produce their food, and kinds of transportation. But we should decide collectively how we will live, basically. So that's one part. The second part, and why we call it Half-Earth Socialism, is that when we approached those questions, we came up with what we thought would be the best solution, and that would basically be giving people a somewhat modest but still decent living standard, lower than is maybe normal in the global north, but much higher for most places in the global south. It would also incorporate veganism. It would incorporate public transportation. It would incorporate rewilding on a massive scale. So that means increasing the amount of nature preserves from around 10 or 15% to around half of all land, and to have a transition to renewable energy. So these are the components that we see to be extremely important to solve not just the climate crisis, but also the problem of pandemics and extinction. And we argue that these different problems have to be thought together, and socialism is the best way to achieve that.
Right, and so that's when you say half that Earth is protected. That's where you get half Earth socialism, that concept, right? Where the idea is half the Earth is walled off, protected for habitats for non-humans. Is that a fair characterization?
Well, I think we would say that. So there is a sort of, in the conservationist movement, a half-Earth sort of movement that does maybe push from that more strict distinction, strict non-human nature preserves. We point out in the book that biodiversity is often higher on indigenous lands than in nature preserves. So we don't need to follow that exact conservationist line. Half-Earth socialism would involve indigenous sovereignty, for example. But the point there is that to protect against the ongoing sixth mass extinction in Earth's history, where we're losing species at a very high rate, and we should care about that, not just because we should care about the other things on this planet, but because it impacts us. This planet keeps us alive, it keeps everything going. So we should care about that, and that's driven by ecosystem loss. So we should take seriously this need to have stable ecosystems, and that involves ecosystems functioning healthy in a healthy way. And so there are many ways to achieve that. It doesn't need to be one picture, but it does need to be functioning in a healthy
No,
way.
I was overly simple because I mean you critique or expand on the concept from E.O. Wilson, who at least in the beginning part of your book, whereas I guess it's a bit of a starting off point, but the you kind of yes and that concept. Do you mind talking about it from its origin versus how you expanded upon it?
Sure. So E.O. Wilson works with other ecologists in the 1960s, and they find a relationship between land area and biodiversity. They were actually studying islands at that point in time, so larger islands have more biodiversity. And you actually can work out a pretty mathematical relationship to figure out that how much biodiversity you would expect in a certain land area. So what they discovered a few decades later was that nature preserves as we have them now act as islands surrounded by fields, for agricultural produce or pastures of cities, of mines, or whatever it is. But because we have taken so much of nature, these nature preserves are separate from each other in other wild areas. And therefore, if we only protect around 10 or 15% of the world, then we can expect quite severe biodiversity loss in the rest of the world, and that would be around 50%. So that's what they expect based on this relationship of land area to biodiversity. So if you want to prevent that loss, you would actually increase the amount of protected areas, and that would, to us, they propose 50%, which would preserve around 85% of species. So you still would lose 15% of species, which is not great, but it's not nearly as bad as previous mega extinctions. And there have been other conservationists who have worked on this problem, and we get into the intellectual history of this idea. So Wilson is important, but we also have these South African conservationists, led by Ian Player, and then there's also an American group called the Wildlands Network led by Dave Foreman, and they don't have very good politics. So Wilson is, that puts it very mildly. They're very Malthusian, they're racist, colonialist, they work with Rhodesian mercenaries, they like the apartheid, government, they want to keep out, Mexican immigrants, all this really awful stuff. And then E.O. Wilson, who definitely has been criticized a lot for his views on sociobiology. He has also worked with some, race scientists that we've discovered recently with some investigative journalism. So he's definitely not a perfect figure, and we're not trying to whitewash any of that. Indeed, our book tries to really criticize the environmental movement and say that conservation is really important, but we have to deal with this colonial past so we can make a broader coalition. And then the last thing I'll say is the conservation movement we have now, it maybe isn't as wicked as it was before, but they still depend on philanthropists. They depend on people like Ted Turner and other billionaires to give lots of money and buy up a lot of land. And this is not a good solution either. So we're saying socialists should care about conservation, but it needs to be a socialist conservation.
Right. And so can you do you mind expanding a little bit historically on the conservation movement as a whole? And I think you laid out well where it needs updating and an embedding of socialist ideology, but beforehand, where were the emphases wrong in particular?
I'll be brief, and then I'm sure Drew wants to jump in. So, we go back quite a ways in the book. We go back to the 18th century to think about different approaches to environmental thought. And we say there's a Hegelian approach, and that is part of the Marxist tradition as well. And that means we see history as a story of people dominating nature, what Hegel calls humanizing nature, and that means we work in the environment and we transform it and we instill it with human consciousness. And the end of history will be a utopia where all of nature has been humanized. Like everything is a canal or a field or a garden and so forth, right? And that's one tradition, and that has many problems, which maybe we can get into. And the other would be also from the late 18th century is Malthus's attack on utopianism at that time, and he says basically that humans will always have too many children if there's any kind of prosperity that will lower living standards, and it only can be what he calls positive checks of epidemics or starvation or war that will then lower population. So utopia is impossible. And then Malthusian views have become extremely important for the environmental movement in the 60s and 70s, where they see most environmental problems as caused by having too many people, and therefore they have to
Right.
control population. And that's really
Well,
the
that's very
problem.
dangerous, right? I mean,
Yeah,
and
well, yeah,
you see the right in modern times adopting that to a degree as well. I would say that the more forward-thinking fascist types, Tucker Carlson has been flirting with the concept of overpopulation. That's where some of those roads lead.
Oh yeah, I mean we've had eco-fascist mass shooters that would say that there's too many poor brown people and white people need to control other populations through genocide. And again these environmentalists in like the 60s and 70s, they were quite open and saying like we need to stop food aid, we need to let people starve to death. And these are like the cuddly environmentalists that people like, such as like Paul Ehrlich or even like the limits to growth project and all that. And then there's worse people, of course, like Garrett Hardin, who comes up with the tragedy of the commons, which is a very widely known concept. He was directly tied to the white nationalist movement in the United States. So there's definitely a really ugly history for sure that leads up to the present. And our point is when we write this book is to say that environmentalists and conservationists really have to give up Malthus, right? And that's important too, because the problem that we're facing with the environmental crisis isn't caused by overpopulation. That's not a major part of the problem, right? The cause of the crisis is capitalism, and then also if you aren't Malthusian and you're not racist or you're not colonialist, then you can make better coalitions to achieve your goals.
Right. Drew, did you want to jump in?
Well, I'll just add real quick that there was a reason that the person that Marx hated more than anyone pretty much was Malthus. Like Marx calls him a plagiarizer, which is Marx's worst insult that he can offer in his writing, which is sort of hilarious. Because Malthus is writing against projects of liberation through this angle. So it's really important to remove that.